This is the podcast overview for the objectives that go with Chapter 1, Introduction to Social Psychology and Research Methodology. So I'm going to just go through each of these objectives so you kind of get a sense of what you'll be covering in the chapter. First off, you're going to be starting with a definition, a working definition of social psychology. What makes social psych different from just psych in general? You're going to be learning a little bit about the subfield of social psychology and the different types of issues that this field looks at and researches and is involved with. We'll look at the 4 key components of a science. Now, this really applies to any science. It's a very standard format of how to approach research questions. We kind of have a mindset that we use so that we remain objective in our methodology. Then we're going to contrast social psychology with common sense approaches to knowledge. A lot of things within social psychology seem at face value very common sense. However, they're not. You'll find that we often need objective answers to our questions of things that we see happening around us. A lot of times, common sense tells us one thing, but when we start to dig a little deeper and do some research, we realize that sometimes things aren't as common sense as they seem. So we'll kind of dispel some of the myths there a little bit. Then we're going to look at the relationship between evolution and social behavior. This is relating social behavior to that evolutionary perspective on behavior. So looking at how people have evolved certain traits and attributions and attitudes over time, and why this may be the case from an evolutionary perspective. We'll then turn to looking at some major contemporary research trends in social psych. So currently, how do social psychologists conduct research? What kinds of questions are they interested in today? And this brings us to the field of social neuroscience, which is sort of a hot topic as we're learning more about the brain, and the field of neuroscience is growing. We're relating a lot of what we're learning about the brain to social behavior. So we'll dive in there a little bit. Then we'll look more the second half of the chapter at specific research methods. So we'll take a look at the advantages and limitations of systematic observations and the survey method. So in social psych, we often start there. We start with observing other people and behavior in a systematic way. We don't just observe, but we record and we write down. And we use those observations usually as a launching point for future research. We might also choose to use the survey method, which many of you have taken many surveys. You know what a survey is. But how do we construct a survey? What is a good way to go about doing that? How do you decide what questions go on a survey, in what order, who to give your survey to, how to give your survey? So we'll take a look at all of those methods involved. And usually this is where, like I said, we start. We start with some observations about behavior. Maybe we send out a survey to get a little bit better idea. And then that gives us some more grounded observations and work to go off of to launch us into maybe the next step, which might be doing some correlations and looking at how things relate to each other, or even experimentation. So then next we will turn to looking at correlational method and what it means when we're using correlation coefficients. The pros and cons of this method. Obviously, correlational method, it's correlating things. It's finding the relationship that exists between variables, one thing and another thing. How do they correlate, or do they? And in what way? Positively, negatively? What does that mean? And then we'll look at how this is often used in social psych, but some of its drawbacks too. It can't answer all your questions because, again, we're only looking at the relationship of things, how they relate to one another. It does not infer causality, so we can't know the cause of something from correlational research. So to do that, we would turn next to the nature of experimental method. So we're going to take a look at all the elements of an experimental study. Okay, so the independent variables, the dependent variables, having a control group and an experimental group, the various ways that we go about conducting an experiment, what you need to have in place for that experiment to prove valid and reliable, that people are going to trust that what it's showing is true, and that we can draw causality from it. So the reason people do experimental designs is because then we can say one thing causes another. One variable causes another variable to happen. Okay, if we wanted to relate alcohol and drinking with abuse, we could say alcohol causes abusive behavior. Now, that's just an example, but to make that kind of a statement that alcohol causes abusive behavior, we'd need to do a study that beyond a shadow of a doubt proves that that is in fact the case. We can't just correlate, how much a person drinks with, their type of behavior. That wouldn't explain the why. Then we will turn to looking at developing our theories a little bit more and what kind of procedure is involved in building a theory. I have an idea about something that I'm thinking about researching. How do I develop that into something that I can tangibly measure in a study? So we'll consider things like deception. In social psychological research, deception is often used because we're trying to get at true behavior of an individual. And sometimes we can't get at a person's true behavior unless they don't know what it is we're looking for. So in other words, we have to not be completely transparent in how we go about designing our studies so that our participants don't try to guess at what we're researching and then change their behavior accordingly. And deception is going to be one of the big topics in our discussion posting for this week. So you'll be taking a look at what kinds of deception are used in social psych research, when and why, and how do we make it ethical. We obviously don't want to deceive people to the point where we're harming them or hurting them or putting them in danger. That would be unethical. So then we'll look at some of the steps that need to be taken to make sure that deception is used correctly and that overall our research is done ethically. So we'll look at things like informed consent and debriefing, which are very important in social psychological research. They're necessary elements. And we'll look as well at what the APA, the American Psychological Guidelines, say about what you need to do when you conduct research studies. They have some key elements and principles that must be in place in order for your study to get approval from an institutional review board. This is a board that is in place at every single institution, whether it be educational or corporate. Anybody who's conducting research needs to get approval of an IRB that basically says your study's okay, you're not going to hurt anyone or harm anyone, and we believe that you can ethically conduct your study. And that's important. You cannot do a study in the United States without that IRB approval. And I've included a video this week too that talks about ethics in research and why this is so important.